It's time to go to the atomic level. It's time to go.
Welcome to the Atomic Level, the show where we decode the matters of wealth one insightful conversation at a time so that you can grow and protect your net worth and your net happiness. I'm Chris Snook, and today I'm joined by someone I've been following on Substack for the better part of the last year, Tanvi Ratna, who's also a columnist at Fox and who's got her own column on Substack that you absolutely should subscribe to. I think after you listen to this interview, you'll know exactly why. Tanvi, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Chris. It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, you've been all over the world recently, but one of the things that I have been wanting to connect with you is I think that you've got a really interesting lens and research capability that you've demonstrated to me, at least as someone who follows your Substack, related to not all things macro from an investment standpoint, but also from some of the geopolitical strategies and things that are there. And as listeners to this show know, what we're trying to look at is the world as it is, not necessarily as it should be. That's what we'd like to endeavor towards, not as we want it to be, but just as it is, because that's where you can make practical and pragmatic decisions and then help shape whatever your impact's going to be on it. So I think that you've published some stuff recently, specifically around the Iran war, that I know you're in the middle of releasing, I think, part 4, as this is being recorded, so it'll probably be out by the time this drops. We'll put all those in the show notes. But let's talk about your path first. So you're a columnist. You're obviously someone who's been in finance at some level. Talk to us a little bit about your career arc to here, and then we'll get into kind of what your viewpoints are, what your research is telling you, and we'll try and learn and get a new perspective.
Yeah, sure. So my journey's been pretty unorthodox. So I was originally an engineer, so I'm a systems engineer, and I worked in industrial engineering, supply chains, manufacturing, that sort of space. And I then went to grad school. So I was at Georgia Tech, I did engineering, and then I went to Georgetown. I did grad school in foreign affairs, security studies. And, you know, a long time ago, about like more than 10 years ago, I pivoted to geopolitics. And so I worked on the Hill. I was in the Foreign Affairs Committee of Capitol Hill. And that was, you know, during the second Obama term, when there was this whole pivot to Asia and things like that. So I worked on that. And then, you know, the US government at that time had entered a pretty dysfunctional period where, you know, nothing was really moving. And I just, you know, it did seem like, you know, this would be the right place for, sorry, were you saying something?
No, it was the chair.
Okay. So, you know, and I had this curiosity about how policy was working in other countries. And, you know, my family, like, so we're Indian American, and I was curious about what was happening in India. So I had a very interesting opportunity that I worked in where I went to India, and I ended up somehow on the campaign team, the first campaign of Prime Minister Modi, when he was at that time just a state chief minister, and he'd never held national office. And I just somehow found myself in the ringside of this very big transformation that was happening in India, which has sort of made India what it is today as well. So that was very interesting. And then, you know, I stayed for a few years. I worked on this big digital transformation that happened in India, which is more tech policy. And then one thing led to another, and I fell into the space of crypto regulation. So I was at this consulting firm, Ernst & Young. I was working their blockchain side, and I suddenly, you know, like, it was work that led me into it. I started working on crypto regulation, worked with many different regulators in the US, but also in, you know, 10, 11 countries, set up a little think tank on emerging tech regulation. So we looked at crypto, AI, things like that as they relate to national security. And I bound that up and, you know, moved back to the US like 2 years ago. And that's when, all the movement with Trump started. And it just that all the different chapters of my life, they all sort of tie up into this moment that we're in. So manufacturing, supply chains, geopolitics, crypto, AI, they're all central to the strategy that Trump is building. And I also had the fortune of, growing up in different parts of the world. Like I did college some years in Asia, in Singapore, in the US. And so it gave me very holistic perspective on things.
I think that's a great kind of background, because it makes a lot of sense to why I've been, I think, attracted to your writing specifically, is that a lot of that totally jives with how I would expected your background to be made up based on what I've read, because there's just a very holistic viewpoint to the things that you talk about, even if they're just, kind of your analysis of what's happening. I think that there are through lines to each one of those pieces of your background that if you didn't know that you had that background, you might intuit that you did. And so hearing that makes a ton of sense to me. So let's talk about, because I'm glad you talked about, kind of a perspective from your earlier days and kind of being around the Obama administration, a perspective now. If we put all the political derangement syndromes aside and we just try and understand, make an assumption, there is a strategy. And I think whether you agree with that strategy or not is for you to decide. But if we can at least make the assumption that there is a strategy, then we can maybe learn something. And that's why I wanted to have you on the show, because I think you've taken the stance that there is a strategy. And you mentioned that strategy is centered around some of these critical components that essentially make up the global economy, which then impacts the domestic economy, whether you live in India or whether you live in the US or whether you live in any one of the other places that you've mentioned. So what is the strategy that you see being deployed? And then in your writing and in your work, give us kind of what your scorecard looks like so far as that strategy runs up against other status quo systems and beliefs and inertia that have been established over the last 20 or 30 years.
Yeah, I think that's a very tough question to answer in one answer. I mean, that is sort of the all the work that I'm doing right now is answering that question. So I will say, though, that in terms of strategy, I'm not saying this just because, I support a certain point of view or I don't. I've actually worked across the aisle, but I just have been in national security, and I worked on these sort of issues on currency, when the BRICS started de-dollarizing. And that is when I feel like the roots of a lot of this thinking emerged. And also in terms of Trump, like his viewpoints are pretty consistent. So you could go back to the 80s and 90s and like listen to his interviews, and he's saying pretty much the same things he's saying today, So I think the larger, the belief that's driving a lot of the reset is that I believe Trump and the team, they fundamentally believe that this liberal world order has not worked for America. Yes, and America providing security as a public good has not worked in America's favor, and it should not be a burden that the U.S. bears, right? And there is.
I don't want to stop your train of thought there, but I want to pin that point, because that is a lens that I think it's lost in a lot of the mainstream narrative, regardless of which channel they're listening to, which is that at the end of the day, since World War II, at the end of the last fourth turning, for those people who've been fans of the fourth turning or heard me talk about that, when we went into the Bretton Woods Agreement, when we did that, one of the things that we established was essentially a security apparatus that the U.S. was, essentially the lead on, but it was sharing that burden. And over the last several decades, it has taken on a disproportionate share, and it's benefited from that in certain ways, but it's also created some of the challenges we have today. And so when you talk about unwinding any of that, that security apparatus, forget anything else. When you talk about unwinding that, there are economic implications, there are restructured trade deals, there are any number of concessions and contracts, implied or papered, that have to be redone. And that is what we talk about. Maybe I'm interested if you agree with this or if you have a different way of saying it. We talk about the next world order or a new world order, right? We're talking about this new global set of agreements around how we're going to provide whatever we think safety is, so that commerce and those kind of things can occur.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you've sort of said it. I think there are two public goods that this administration sees the U.S. has provided for free, which it will not anymore. One is the security and military umbrella of the U.S. military. And the second is the dollar as a public good, right? And there are arguments that they make that both of these have backfired for the US and they're not fair arrangements. And so these will now no longer be global public goods. They will instead be offered to allies, who will also share the burden.
So let me take the other side of that for my own and for anyone else's understanding. So if I challenge the assumption that we are providing these two public goods, one was the security, right, for free, what are we getting in exchange for? Essentially, maybe we're providing it from a revenue standpoint, like we're the one paying the actual financial bill, or we're the one supplying the arms, or we're the one putting, the boots near wherever they need to be, or the boats wherever they need to be, right? So we might be funding that and not requiring the contribution at the same level from other allies, partners, or people in that agreement. But we are getting something. If I was to take the other side, we may be trading that, but we're getting something in return. In other words, we're not giving it away for free. Yeah. So what are we getting in return? I understand that there's a belief now that no longer works, right? Yeah. But before we get into whether that is, the state of the world or not, what have we been getting?
Yeah, I think it's a great question because so my lens and everything is not very values based. It's more system based. And I think the direction of foreign policy that went into the liberal order, it was very contextualized in the environment that the US was in at that point. And I think it's the post-Cold War era, right? Where the aim was to remake the world in the image of the US, this democratic free market society. And I think at that point, this made a lot of sense as the world order. And I think it worked to a large extent because a lot of the post-Soviet bloc became more open and market integrated, and then you had common systems. So there is a focus on common values where, now there is some tension between whether it's, are they globalist values or Christian values, or, and then you have the Islamist values, which there's a lot of fight about in Iran. But I think in terms of common systems, that had a lot of benefit because a lot of countries became democratic, adopting the same institutional structure that, US and Europe had. And that's what allowed things like the IMF and the World Bank and things like this to work as global coordination mechanisms. But where that model failed is with China, and then later, with some of the BRICS groupings, because even though they integrated into the model, they did not become open market, economies. And they followed industrial policy and things like that, which were, which in a way, some will argue that they gamed the system. I mean, I think people on the other side will say, they worked for everything they got and they had this slow, steady rise. But there's no arguing that even the growth of China had happened because there was this secure global environment, which was provided by, the US military. And this is something I argued in some of my earlier posts, and I got trolled a lot. But I think the idea was to build a world that was very aligned to the US system. And I think when that started failing and that started backfiring, I think that's how we find ourselves to where we are now, where we're stuck of a new world order.
Yeah, I want to. So something I've been kind of forming as a thesis over the last several years, decade, whatever you want to call it, right, is something I want to specifically ask you, because I think you're the right person to challenge the assumptions or validate some that I'm not certain of but feel pretty good about. And so the second piece of what you said was that we provided the US dollar and its infrastructure as the second public good to a broader set of the world in the post-Cold War economy. And so when we look past like 1971 and we get off the gold standard and we essentially create fiat as the monetary system, at that point we created a network effect through all this liberal kind of world order that was established with the security state. The second piece of that security state was the penetration of our monetary apparatus through IMF, World Bank as our kind of infrastructure partners along with the Fed, that propagated the US dollar as the default world reserve currency. And at that point, when the majority of dollar debt or debt is denominated in dollars, and when the majority of settlements are happening in dollars, there becomes this dependency on the dollar from places that can't just print it, meaning they have to swap and they have to do that. And so we could kind of create stability in one regard. We also, in my opinion, were able to export inflation when we felt like it to other parts of the world, whether it be Estonia or whatever, meaning like all of a sudden we kind of normalized certain things, like single family homes rose here, they rose in Iceland, they rose in Estonia, they rose in other places, but we didn't see the impact of inflation onshore as we might have, given the amount of debt we've printed in the last decade alone. And so there was a benefit to us from that, whether we want to maintain that or not. There was a benefit as we went from 8 trillion to 40 trillion in national debt, right, in a short period of time. There was also China kind of, I think, taking a 300 to 400 year view. And again, you could say they were gaming a system, or you're saying they were just following a system that was smart for their own reasons. And they started Belt and Road. They started to do things to basically get benefit from the world order that they were now a part of, but at the same time, kind of extract as much of it as they could for their own designs. And they became a true counterparty, in the global economy because of that. And as we put all the supply chains into there, we created kind of another embedded network effect that worked against US dominance or sovereignty, because now we had this reliance. So where we maintain it still and where we have given it up is more of a balancing act than it is a complete wrong idea, in my opinion. Like, it's almost like we had something that designed and worked well for certain things, but it also kind of swung too far out in one direction, or just met a player that was up for the match. And now we have this kind of new Cold War that's being played out through these proxy hot wars by other parties, and now we're involved in it. So again, react to that, because I'm still working through that, but I think that's an important context to understand just how the money flows, and Japan being a big piece of that too, because they've just recently, kind of returned to, hey, we're going to repatriate capital with certain incentives as they raise their, bonds interest rates for the first time in 3 decades. So there's like a lot of plumbing that is in place, and now the flows are starting to go in opposite directions, and people aren't really aware of that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'll try to speak to the underlying dynamics in that, right? Because there's many theaters where it's playing, like from Europe to Japan to China. But I think, yes, the counter is that, having China in the system, it created lots of wealth effects, for the US, like whether it's with carbon margins, whether it's the prices of goods, the diversity, cost of living, things like that. It did create a lot of wealth effects. And I think in my reading of things, I feel like the problem really exacerbated with the de-dollarization push around the BRICS. And, the last 10 years of this real concentration of supply chains that, China has been working on. I think that is actually when the tipping point sort of came. And I really feel like what is happening right now is usually something that happens after a war, this kind of reordering. So really, for me, this is a war without bullets. This is a reordering that you're forcing through political mechanisms like tariffs and things like that, but it is as fundamental a reordering as there is post-war, right? And so I think in terms of how that is breaking the system, we are seeing so many ways in which that is playing out. So absolutely on capital, like you said. So, Japan, was, I wrote about this in the Capital Wars essays, like how their move to liquidity sort of led to this massive liquidity trap situation in the markets. And Japan is now, even look at the way that Sane Takeshi has managed things. She already won the election and came to power. She has a very different agenda than has traditionally been in place in Japan. She's not afraid to ruffle feathers. She's going to go all out on defense spending. She's going to go hard in China. She's going to go big on fiscal spending for Japan, for, making sure the middle class and, people are not hard hit. So she needs money for that. And she has to pass a big budget. And so instead of, trying to do what had been done for a long time, which is you do the things in a way that you adjust and you kind of try to not shake the boat, she actually called for snap elections. And so what happened is she ended up with now, 2/3 majority in the House. Now she can do whatever she wants. She could have lost everything. So she's very similar in that way to Trump. Like, she took that gamble. She took that risk. She could have lost.
I think that's an interesting point, is that populism, if that's what you want to genericize it at, is not just happened here, and it's happened in other places, but these things are giving a credibility, or if nothing else, a momentum to what the current administration here is trying to do.
Yeah. Yes, and I actually would argue it started in other places, and I think I got to be a part of seeing that in India. That came with Modi. Now it's his 3rd term, so it's like 10 plus years of this, this movement. You saw it happen with Xi, you saw it happen with Erdogan in Turkey, you started seeing, some of Meloni and these kind of, so there was this massive move to the right, which had started actually along with Trump's first term. So that has now consolidated. And the place where the fight is very acute is now in Europe, right? And that's why you're seeing so much, so many fault lines around, oh, US is meddling in our elections. But then the center-right parties are gaining momentum, and then they're using X and all these platforms, and so there's a lot going on in terms of populism, as you'll say, as a force. But I would say more sovereignty as a force, and
That's a good frame. I think that's what it is too. I think populism is what has been proliferated through the narrative arc, because it's historically kind of what we look at when we look at other parallels in history. But sovereignty is really at the core. In other words, populism for the sake of what? And the sake of what is sovereignty, whether it's Japanese sovereignty, whether it's US sovereignty, whether it's Italy's sovereignty, whether it's UK. And we kind of are shifting. We have this collision between people that kind of wanted a one world order with these different kind of chieftains, to one where we actually have a multipolar order that is, I don't want to call it a meritocracy, but that essentially functions like, if I have to deal with you, I will. I'm not going to go through somebody else anymore. And that's a shift in psychology that hasn't had a chance to play out, but is getting enough different interest groups, be it countries or what have you, to say, yeah, I think I want some of that for me too, where it's shaking up and it's creating this friction. Because even the quote unquote powers that be don't necessarily, they can't get along to go along anymore. There's kind of like they have to take a stance, but they're not yet sure which stance they're going to take, because they're still worried about getting elected, or still worried about whatever it may be, right?
Yeah.
But so what's your take? Let's jump into one of the theaters, because it's the one that's on everybody's mind as we record this, right? Which is Iran. So Trump comes in and settles 8 of 9 wars, still working on the 9th one, all that stuff, right? Which I have my own, kind of opinion on of whether that was what that actually was as part of the strategy. But it's net positive, meaning 8 wars get settled. 1 is still out there with Ukraine and Europe, or in Russia. And then we go and we do the things, we do in Iran. It doesn't stop anything. And now we're here where we are. We're in a hot war with Iran. And if you were to go back to your earlier comment around, we're basically using a bulletless type of war to fight World War III to get to the outcome that usually happens after a world war. Now it's harder to argue that we aren't on the path to a world war, even though you could make that argument. But why are we doing what we're doing in Iran? There's the obvious thing around, okay, we can't let them have nukes. There's all those surface level things, but you have a very unique opinion on why we're doing what we're doing in Iran. I want to kind of share that.
Yeah, so I sort of see the moves from the start in a sort of continuity, in a spectrum, and I believe that the process that the tariffs opened the door to, I see Iran as the culmination of that process. I see it as sort of the climactic theater that is going to force everything into position. Whatever you start rejigging over the last year, that all has to fall in a line. And I see Iran as the sort of this nerve center, or like this pressure point that transmits into every single system you're trying to reshape, whether it's security architecture, or it's trade, it's power structures, it's ideology, like values, all those things. This is the hub of it. And so that is what I pushed out as my original thesis statement. I'd given one early Substack at the start of the war where I said, I see already that the US is transitioning into the second phase of the presidency, which is a lot of new economic structures are going online. So whether it's domestic reindustrialization, or it's Pax Silica, or it's this new, AI exports program, everything is shifting into new industrial policy, or a new phase. This is a new phase we're entering. It's no longer about getting deals, resetting terms, and things like that. So as this new phase is going online, I can understand why they're forcing the old realignment process to come to a close, right? And that is what I believe is happening in Iran. And so I see at least 11 different ways in which it is rejigging things. And I can probably categorize that better into a few theaters. But let's start with the obvious ones that people are seeing, right? So, of course, around energy, major supply chains, those kind of, what do we call them? Like critical resource supply chains. There's already, you can see global furor and movement and things like that. The second most obvious one is around geographic choke points and trade routes, right? And if you see for all the major, systems that go from Asia to the US, Asia, Europe, US, Iran sort of sits at the center of everything, right? And it has been that node which has been used always by China, Russia, or any competing bloc to create a alternative or create a challenger route, or a corridor. So there is a whole geographic element to it. I think there is the biggest problem, the biggest rejigging. There are two layers of political alignment that's forcing to happen. The first is within the region, right? And this is what my first few essays were focused upon, because there is that intractable issue that Trump has faced since the first Abraham Accords, where you need to get, so Saudi and UAE are like the de facto hegemons of the Gulf region, right? And Israel actually has completely changed its doctrine in the last 2 years, going from this defensive actor with just, every time someone there'll be like limited operations in the West Bank and that's it. They've gone from that to like a very offensive, very hard military doctrine. And it's curious that people just never question that. They just assume that everybody is, that is their nature, or they're just trying to like kill. Or no, they actually, the October 7th attack really shook the establishment of Israel, because what they realized is, the doctrine they followed for so many years, which was we keep the most advanced border, the most secure everything, and we only respond when someone pokes us. What they realized is all of that failed, and they got infiltrated and attacked in a way that they, it just had not worked. Everything they had done for their security had not worked. And that whole doctrine that they followed for all these years, which they used to call it mowing the lawn. So literally when the grass grows so much, you just go out and mow it. And that was pretty much it. They went back and they redrew the whole doctrine, and they said, what has happened is in all these years of letting the Shia axis and the Sunni axis sort of harden around us, now these things become so structurally strong and so all-encompassing, because the thing to understand about Iran and the Shia axis is it's not just Iran, it's not just one country. Over the last, 15 plus years, they have set up this network of proxies, which also people just think are militias, and they're just some small militias, like the Houthis are just bandits, and like they're Hezbollah, just like they're just civilian militia. It's not. It's quite sophisticated, because these are not just armed resistance groups. They are actually embedded within governments of these countries. They're embedded within civilian networks. So like the Hezbollah is embedded with the Lebanon government, and in Iraq you have this, I think the PMK forces, they have government budgets, they have government protection, they have roles in there, and then they have the civilian links that you saw in Gaza, which is what Israel attacked is so brutally, right? So the Shia axis is a system. It's not just Iran and like, oh, we're just going to attack Iran and like take down the regime. No, this is a I want to like I'm wondering which James Bond villain I can compare this to. Like, it's a network and a system, and it's very.
Is it fair enough to almost analogize it to like a mercenary intelligence group? I know. I mean, again, if we just look at it as the function inside of a system, not as a moral value judgment, terrorist organizations that are well funded and well organized, which these are, do they serve as like a intelligence apparatus for countries that don't have one?
I know they're not mercenary. That's a problem. So I would say it's like they're a bit like Hydra, no? Like, I mean, that's okay, that's Marvel, but like
right.
It's ideological, and it's structured, it's embedded, it's civilian, but it's also, military intelligence or operation. It's how do you categorize it? It's not a state actor, but it's also not a state actor. It's its own entity. So they were faced with a system, and so their doctrine hardened, and then they started raising these populations. That created lots of trouble in the Sunni side of the axis, which is all the Gulf countries, Turkey, Egypt, Pakistan, all these countries, because they saw sort of an opportunity. So in the Sunni field, there are some big fault lines that have been there for a long time. So Saudi, UAE see themselves as actually a little anti-Islamist, at least under the new rulers. These guys are more progressive. They see themselves as having modern economies, move away from the Islamization, move towards modern market-oriented economies. And then you have Turkey and Qatar, which are really anchoring that idea of like an Islamist caliphate. Qatar, we know, is the Muslim Brotherhood, Al-Qaeda. A lot of those, the training hubs were like some blocks down from the U.S. military base that they essentially paid for a base, and had the U.S. take it. And so you had always competition in these blocks, and then you've had very seismic shifts in the doctrine of these countries. Like the UAE has aligned a lot more openly with Israel, ever since the Abraham Accords, but even after. And that has created a lot of insecurity in Saudi. And Saudi had sort of started moving towards the Abraham Accords. That's why you saw Trump go to Saudi. Like, Trump went to no other country to make deals. But you can understand how important, if Saudi comes on board, even now this is true, if Saudi and Israel Trump can broker a compromise between, then you can have this lasting board of peace sort of arrangement.
I think it's, I had an interesting perspective last February. I was at the third FII down in Miami, and I'd been to the other two, and so I'd kind of seen the first 3 years of that happening in Miami. It's been happening obviously in Riyadh now for I think 9 years. I think next year will be 10, and it was very interesting to see the energetic ambiance of the room, as it were, last year. I didn't go this last month. There was just one a couple weeks ago or a couple days ago, but I didn't go this last one. But I was there last year, and last February, which was 30 days after the election, or the inauguration, 30 days after the inauguration, compared to the February before, there was just a noticeable shift. And so even though we were kind of dealing with like some uncertainty in tariffs and all this stuff that was like being talked about, and people were like, I don't know how it was, the ambiance of a room filled with allocators from around the globe of capital was like, oh, we're going to be fine. Like, this is going to work out. Like, this has been 4 years waiting to kind of re-engage. And it was like, no one said that out loud, right? But it was just my interpretation of it. I remember calling several folks afterwards and just saying, listen, based on what I just saw, like, there's a plan here. There's a lot of things happening. There's a lot of alignment. There are things that are moving. Now, you could say whether you like that or not, but the reality is it was obvious to me last year that there was a considerable effort that had been happening and waiting kind of for a moment to re-engage itself after the Abraham Accords had been written, and that they were now ready and kind of hopeful despite all the near-term shock. And I think that's still there. And I say that because, like, if I hadn't had that perspective, I think I'd be looking at this whole thing differently. And there are risks, obviously. I mean, there's some major risks that this thing could spin out of control and become, something that wasn't designed. I'd like to hear your opinion on what those scenarios look like, the off ramps, as it were, and what the outcome, what the real outcome is designed to be. And then I have my own thought on it that we haven't talked about with AI yet, but I want to kind of get in that. But before I do that, like, what does your scenario playbook look like from here out when we think about the Iran war specifically, and then what the risks and implications are?
Yeah, so I think I've spent a lot of time in terms of thinking about what objective makes sense for Trump, what end objectives make sense for Trump, right? And so that's why I said there's all these theaters that I feel he's going to align. So I think the one big outcome security-wise that he will drive us to in the Middle East is the board of peace. I think the board of peace has to come back on track. And Saudi had pivoted away from it a few months ago, and that has to come back on track. So I think that is something he will move things to. The second thing is, I think in terms of corridors, I've written about the ATOMIQ before. I've written, that's the India, Middle East, Europe corridor. It basically becomes a new zone of high economic growth. And that is also the reason that, Gaza, when it was a live conflict, ATOMIQ could not have happened as long as Gaza was there. ATOMIQ could not have happened as long as Iran is a problem and the proxies are a problem. So I feel like if the board of peace happens, then these new trade corridors go online, right? Third thing that I see as an end objective for him is to get that grand bargain with Russia. So when I see the overall geopolitical chessboard, the overarching, I think, compulsion for any geopolitical strategist for the US will be break apart Russia and China. You need to break apart that alliance. You need to pull Russia out of that orbit. And I think enough people have talked about this reverse Nixon, reverse Kissinger move, which Trump has. There's enough evidence to show that that's what he's been working towards, some kind of bargain with Putin, some kind of bargain with Russia, where Russia is re-engaged in the Western Hemisphere, re-engaged in the financial system. It's given its role in the state of things. The war in Ukraine is settled, and this dragon bear alliance that they talk about gets broken. I think that is geopolitically very essential. So some people are expecting a grand bargain with Russia and China, but I think with China it's trickier. It might happen. Let's see what happens with this new negotiation. But at least with Russia, I think grand bargain, that's the third thing I see is essential for Trump. And the fourth and the final one, the main one that I think a lot of what he's doing in Iran, I think it's Israel's objectives that are more on the Middle East. It's for the US, I think the objectives are in Europe. Everything is about Europe. Like a lot of the pain that will come from the energy markets, I feel is going to disproportionately hit Europe, because Asia is starting to get supplies, like India, China, Pakistan, Thailand, they're getting supplies. And they might come to some arrangement with Iran, but I don't think Europe will. And I don't think Europe will buy Russian energy. And if they double down on US energy, then again, Trump is going to push them on Greenland and NATO. So I think there's a lot of questions in Europe which have to be settled. And that, I think, brings me to my final thing, which I think is the underlying piece and everything, which is where it gets more conspiratorial. But I think it's the old Epstein network and the deep state network and, the blob, as they call it, the old system that Trump has sort of come in as a maverick and broken up and shaken up. They are fighting back, and that is a global network. The one that you say is a sort of global government, a globalist culture, rather than having sovereign cultures. Like, yeah, it's that piece, and I think ultimately that is what they're fighting. So if the Islamists are like Hydra, I think I read some analysts say, the Epstein network is like Scepter, and it is the absolute elite, powerful, global, like the Illuminati or something, right? So I do feel like it sounds very conspiratorial, but I am seeing traces of this. And I teased some of this, when someone was saying, like, why did the insurers immediately stop insuring the boats even before anyone closed the strait, right? Before Iran closed the strait, or before any major attacks happened, like, why did the insurers stop insuring the boats, right? I think that is some traces of the globalist network. And I think that is the final frontier that he has objections on.
So one of the takes that I've been ruminating on is, and I'm curious about your opinion on this. So I'm getting ready to publish a piece that just reframes this whole thing around artificial intelligence as the arms race, right? As the nuclear armament of this era. So when we had the Cold War before, it was all a race for nuclear supremacy as the power projection protocol that said, don't mess with me, because if you do, I can basically end it all, right? And that that arms race now, you could argue, is around intelligence itself as it's been commoditized. And if you look at all of this through the lens of artificial intelligence, there are a couple forces that come into play. One of them is energy, right? Because it's obvious that requires a lot more energy than we can produce right now, regardless of where we're producing it or where we're buying it or selling it from. That's on top of the energy needs we already have. And water, because you need that until Elon decides with, Jensen to put everything in space. You need water to cool these things. But the aquifers in many places, if you follow Matter on Substack, you've read about adaptation intelligence and some of his work, which is fascinating. But one of the other forces is just natural resources that are conveniently forgotten when we put out all these projections around ROI and investment of capital, and and BlackRock and Goldman are all doing their reports on the future of AI and how big it's going to be. It doesn't mention the fact that we're running out of water in places where humans live, but also where we're putting data centers that are going to consume it even faster. And we're not talking about running out of it over in a decade or 2 or 3. We're talking about 18 to 36 months where millions of people will all of a sudden not be able to have water. And, oh, by the way, the data center won't work. So, when you think about water, there's this kind of underlying thing that humans can't live without food and water. Machines don't need water, but they need energy and they need to be cooled. And then the third piece is China and us are basically trying to define what society will look like, right? So if we take the Western approach, or we take the, Chinese doctrine, regardless of who thinks they're right, they're both trying to win that hegemony, or in our case, maintain the hegemony. And so if you look at it all through the lens of that, and you say, well, what is Iran? I mean, with all the other things that it could be, my contention is the Strait of Hormuz is 20% of the global oil supply moves through that every day or whatever, right? And so we've already seen the impacts of what happens when that gets disrupted, whether it's shut down, closed, or toll roaded or whatever. Gas in where I live is now $6 a gallon, right? Overnight. And so, and that's if diesel's $7.20 a gallon. And so that puts pressure on your local economy, which then makes it hard to get reelected or keep your control of the House and Senate, which you're already battling, because people don't care. They just see their prices go up, and their life get worse. And then they're worried about their job being lost to AI. And all these things happen, right? And they don't have the time to contextualize everything that you just spent the last 30 minutes putting out there for us to think about, but they're impacted by it. And if you're China, you have the same thing. You have, I think, 17% or something I've seen is high in youth unemployment. There's a nihilism there. There's a movement that in translation says lie flat, right? Meaning like, I'm just going to lie flat and do nothing. And so they have some issues there that, a lot of people don't know about, related to their own social unrest. But they also still have the CCP, which can dictate or, do things that not. And we hear about Taiwan. So if you think about the 2 choke points, you have the fact that all the chips that we need to power these things come out of basically China in one way, shape, or form, whether it's the rare earths that refined or whatever. And Taiwan is where they come out of. And although we've built, stuff in Arizona, we don't have anywhere near 90% of the chip supply still comes off of that island in Taiwan. And China's only reason not to invade it, I could argue, is the fact that they are still dependent on Iran's oil to a degree that they can't pull that trigger. So it's a lever. So if you can't control Taiwan, but you attack Iran and you dismantle it under all the other premises that you already said, what you also have is you have a lever to trade in a negotiation if needed. And China can choose to escalate and go surround Taiwan and invade it, but it doesn't really serve them, because then we are in a World War III. And I think all of this has to do with the fact that we're all dependent on this for this AI future that's coming at us in nanoseconds.
Mm-hmm.
But what are your thoughts on that thesis? Pick that apart for me.
Yeah, so I might have a different take on this. So I do agree that, Trump thinks in terms of leverage, and so he definitely does create leverage for himself as he walks into that negotiation with Xi. Because I think in the last year, the U.S. did not have much leverage in that negotiation with China, and that is what led them to just get this, 1 year period, just where we kind of muddle through things. That's all we got as an extension and no deal as such. So maybe they will get to a deal, right? I think in terms of AI as what role does Iran have in that? I think I really see Iran more for the purpose of corridors and security and trade and the system view, like the petrodollar and things like that. I think when it comes to AI, what I'm looking at is there's that whole wave of energy innovations, like in nuclear or all the space stuff that Elon is launching, and spaceship and terafab and stuff like this. All these kind of things are where I think the solutions for the US are going to be. It's going to be in the innovative technologies, out of the box technologies. As far as China and Taiwan, so I think either there is going to be some invasion within the coming weeks, because you've seen all that naval activity. So, all these Chinese fishing boats, like I was very curious when I started seeing that news last year, and it's become pretty apparent that they are mapping, different parts of the ocean, different parts of the straits, the subsea cables, with all that kind of terrain is what these fishing boats are mapping. So are they getting ready for some kind of submarine and naval conflict? It could be. But I also think, I do think Trump might consider a grand bargain with China as well, where they, I don't, a lot of people say, will he just let them keep Taiwan if we instead look at gains for other fields? I don't know if that's very likely, though, because, you've seen Japan as the way he's working is he said, Japan, you manage your security and spending, but then, yes, you get free reign in Asia. Israel gets more reign in Middle East, and so Japan has kind of said that if, hinted that if anything happens on Taiwan, they will intervene against China. They will not let China take over Taiwan. So that's not really a theater I've looked at too much right now, because all my time's going into Iran. But I think there could be a bargain on it. I think in terms of AI, I think the US is actually trying to get as free of other countries as it can get. So I think a lot of space and nuclear and those kind of avenues is what it's looking at.
Yeah, and I think the Western Hemisphere side of things, right? It almost looks as though we're going, okay, imagine a world where there could be a dual hegemony or some version of that. Mm-hmm. And maybe not on the currency side, but on the security side or the whatever. We have the Philippines, we have Japanese interests. They're never going to play nice with China, right? Based on their history. And so there's these kind of things that make it a little challenging because it's not clean, to say the least. But at the same time, from an energy standpoint, when you can control, enough of your energy production and output and storage on one half of the planet, and you have Brazil and Latin America and everybody else kind of lining up to benefit from those deals as well, and Argentina and things like that, then you create kind of a natural bifurcation. The other side of that is, you mentioned it, Europe. Where do they sit? What happens to the European Union is kind of, I think, a big question, because it seems very hard to imagine a world where 10 years from now it's still intact. I mean, maybe it is, but if that IMEC corridor, becomes a thing, does that help keep it intact, or do you think that helps split it up amongst two different sides?
I don't know the answer to that. I mean, I am going to Europe next, and I can tell you what I see happening as dynamics there. So I think there is an activation of the east and south side of Europe, into the new alliance, a new idea of the alliance. So as I wrote in my essay, I mean, Israel has activated this new hexagonal security strategy. That's why, Israel had this deal with Delhi, it had this deal with UAE, and they are activating Greece and Cyprus and these maritime states to the left and north of Israel to kind of like a quad for that region, around the Suez, around the Red Sea, around the Hormuz. Those countries are getting activated. There is an extension of the ATOMIQ, which goes through certain countries in Eastern Europe, which is called the Three Seas Initiative. And that has your Italy, Croatia, Greece, so these countries, and then you, of course, have Hungary, which has always been the sort of conservative voice within the EU. So I see a lot of these countries getting activated on issues of Islamist immigration. They don't want to have a lot of that. That's encouraging them to partner with Israel on that agenda, right? I think that's also why New Delhi is partnered with Israel. It's the anti-Islamist kind of access. And you see them partnered on the idea of the ATOMIQ. So I think a lot of Eastern Europe is betting heavily on the ATOMIQ, Romania, Croatia, all that, because then they get sort of linked into the high growth corridor regions, right? So in Europe, there is a lot of this movement. And then, of course, the stuff we already hear about in the US, which is the rise of the right parties and things like this, which are already happening. So I think in Europe, there's a lot to unpack there. I will, start doing that in the later writings. But Europe, I see as the center of this final fight that I said of the globalist versus the new order. Like, Europe is the old order. Like, it is the original hegemon, and they have been embedded in so many structures of the world order. So I think that is the big fight, and I think that's where all the debates of Ukraine, NATO, Greenland are all going to be come to the fore. Yeah.
So as an investor or an allocator, I mean, are there safe havens right now in your opinion, and if so, where?
I actually would not be the right person on Europe. Like, I am myself starting to look into there. Like, I'm going there in 2-3 weeks for an immersion, but I don't know who is neutral anymore. I mean, even Switzerland's not neutral anymore, right? So there's a lot of realignments within Europe. But I do feel that by July, that is, I think, the deadline the administration's working with. I think by then we'll have a pretty clear picture. That is mainly what I argue in the essays is, you are now forcing everyone to pick a side. I think Trump is done with people hedging this side and that side and working with the US and then also working with China, with Russia. No, you don't get access to the public goods. You pick a side and then you get access, right? So I think that world map is going to be very clear after 3 months.
Yeah, I think that, for all the things that I could say that I'm not a fan of, I think that, the one thing that studying history has taught me is that there are active and passive moments in hegemonic leadership, right? And I think we went through a period where we had some passive leadership, and now we're experiencing like a hyperactive of leadership, right? Deals being done, levers being implemented. And if you took a view of it that was like biased because of a political alignment, in other words, if you were red or blue, right, you're going to either go all in on one side or you're going to go all off on the other side. But if you just looked at it as a system, you would recognize that, like, when force enters the equation in any way, things start to move around. And when things start to move around, what appears like chaos sometimes is, and other times what it is it's cause and effect. And most of the time it's cause and effect, right? And so it's kind of like, if you look at some of these moves, whether they've been executed exactly how he thought or they thought or not, they start to line up. Meaning, like, again, if you, it'd be very hard to think that there was no strategy.
Yeah.
Because there's just too many pieces that, in a matter of short periods of time, there are deadlines, there are there are things, there are settlements, there are bombs dropped, there's precision across the board. And so I think it's very hard to not say dispassionately that there is a level of execution in this administration that is historic, and it is noteworthy. And when you given the complexity of everything that you've laid out, which is only the tip of the iceberg, you can kind of appreciate not only how hard that job is as a collective, but as a commander-in-chief or as a head of state or as a European prime minister or as any, like, in other words, the job is not easy and the implications are real. And I think what you want in that regard is you want someone who's up for that job emotionally, mentally, and everything else, in the sense of, like, willing to take that burden on. And if you take a non-moralistic, just practical view of it, you've got some really interesting players on the field between Xi and Putin and Trump and whatever. And now, and you said Modi, and you have, Japanese prime minister, you have some people that are really kind of, in some of the European unions, right, that have stood out and even gone against the grain and have stepped up. And it just is a very historic time to be living in, watching it. And I ultimately almost find comfort in it, despite some of the things that, you worry about. Do you feel similarly, or do you feel more uncertain of the future? Like, in other words, you feel like, where do you think we land on this? You're inside of it more than I am. Where do you think this nets out?
I mean, I think we're really living through history, and I think I feel like I'm watching a world order reset in real time, which is not something I ever thought I would see when I entered this field. And, I was just a college student and I was like, oh, this IR stuff is interesting. I never thought I would get into something like this, but I do think it is a point in history. It's an inflection point in history, and it's something that will be remembered for a long time. And I think what comes after, I think, is going to be a very different economic era. So we're only done with the first year of Trump. I feel like what comes next is going to be the start of the AI industrial age, the manufacturing push and reindustrialization and things like this. A lot of innovation everywhere. And, the thing is, like, with Trump, whatever we might think of him, he has brought in this trend amongst every government on the planet to focus on sovereignty, focus on security, invest in your economy, move towards reform, deregulation. So a wave of this is going to be unleashed. And I believe, as someone who thinks from a free market lens, that will only lead to good.
Right. I tend to agree with that. I think, the reality is that when people can be somewhat enlightened in their self-interest, but when they can see their self-interest, you get a better quality leader And when someone is passionate about their country, whatever that may be, and feels like now is their opening, there's a lane where they can kind of get out of the current line that they've been placed in for decades, and they can kind of find a new position in that line. You get a lot of people raising their hand and standing up that have been waiting for that moment, and that window doesn't stay open very long. And I think the chaos that everyone is uncertain about is this fact that, oh, well, we're watching everybody kind of try and like it's musical chairs, right? Everybody's just running around trying to figure out if they still have a seat. But as the entrepreneur and the investor and kind of the free market person, right, I look at that and I go, well, yes, there are always people that unfortunately get left behind because they're not in the game. They're just kind of NPCs in the video game world, right? Non-player characters just kind of along for the ride. But for those who do want to, see a world where there is a decentralization of economic leverage and interest, and then this is kind of what that looks like, right? Where people can kind of do their own deals direct with who they want to do them with. And it's been set in motion. So the reality is it's out of the bag. I think trying to put it back in the bag creates more mess than letting it play out. That's my 2 cents, if I had an opinion.
Yeah, I think I'll end with that. I think a lot of people are focusing on what is breaking, because that is also the nexus that controls the media, is also the one that is getting broken. And so that is the narrative getting pushed, is things are breaking. But I am fully focused on looking at what is emerging, and I feel it is quite promising.
I think that's why everybody needs to subscribe to your Substack, because again, we do at least live in a world because of innovation and technology where we can discover thought leaders like yourself and others that kind of have different vantage points, and we can consume that directly on a phone we carry around with us 24/7. And I think it is a great place. Whenever stuff is breaking, the flip side of that coin is stuff is emerging, new things are emerging. Whenever there's darkness, then light is just the spark that ends it all. And I think that's a beautiful way of saying that, like, if you're concerned about things, well, then look for what could be emerging that you could be excited about. And if you're wanting my opinion and you're listening to this, I think Tanvi is someone you absolutely will enjoy reading. I thank you for being on the Atomic Level and sharing some banter with me. And I look forward to seeing what you publish next.
Thank you, Chris. It was a pleasure being here.